Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Dave. I'm a parent of a daughter in college, and we live in Chicago, Illinois.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com.
And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm blessed to work alongside both of my daughters. It's School Match for You, the college counseling firm. I founded in 2010.
This week in the news, admitting the top 10% for geographic diversity. A great article in Inside Higher Ed by Doug Lederman. Our question from a listener is, Julia and Mark discuss a speak pipe question. Our interview is Mark and Julia interview Lee Coffin, the VP of Enrollment at Dartmouth College. Lee will cover a range of topics about college admissions, part 1 of 4. And our spotlight, Lynda and Lisa discuss Lynda's recent visit to the University of San Francisco.
My brother from another mother, man. I've barely talked to you since we got to chill in Chicago for 4 days.
I know, we've been traveling.
Yeah, well, thanks again, man. First of all, Fogo de, how do I say that Brazilian steakhouse you
Fogo
took me
de
to?
Chao.
Yeah, that was a great memory, man. Before I went on my diet, I could just completely enjoy it. And
That's
just
right,
imbibe. And then with jazz club we went to and got to hang out with Dave. He hooked me up in the really nice section of his house, and it was really good. But, you know, last month was the first time in 4 years, Dave, you took a month off. So well-deserved, my friend.
Thank you. It was great. My daughter is spending the summer working in Belgium at one of their democracy political think tanks. And my wife spent 3 weeks, and then I joined her for another 2 weeks. And we started off in Paris and then drove to Brussels and then picked up Lauren and headed up to Amsterdam and back down to Ghent and Bruges. And it was a great time. So,
Dave, why don't you say a little more about what Lauren's doing? I mean, our longtime listeners will remember Lauren was on the podcast before. We actually did an interview with her during her COVID year. You know, a lot of our listeners are interested in our kids. Why don't you share what she's doing?
Well, of course, in high school, she was all gung-ho in basic science research and cancer research. And then the moment she got into college, she pretty much told us, hey, I don't think I want to go to medical school. Devastating.
Which Dave still is recovering from this, by the way. He just tells me this story like every 3 months.
Exactly. But she's actually gotten very much into global politics. She's switched into a global affairs major at Yale, and she spent last year at the Harris School of Government at the University of Chicago doing summer research, and this year she got a paid fellowship to work in Brussels, Belgium, with the Center for Economic Development, and she's working on global democracy issues. As we all know, we have some democracy issues here at home and some impending challenges, and she is all full on that. So just another kid trying to save the world instead of doing what their parents tell them to do. So what can I tell you?
And it looks like she's probably on a law school path. Is that fair to say? Do you think that?
Next year, she's actually applying for a series of fellowships. At the very least, there's a combined master's program in public policy in Geneva, Switzerland that Yale does with its global affairs major. So she's probably going to do that if she doesn't get into some of the other fellowships. But she's making all those applications now, so we will keep you guys informed.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate that update. All right. Well, for my admissions tip is going to be some way similar to my big number today, just different sides of the coin. And so the tip has to do with being sensitive to not sending in an application that is too full, too long, where every single time you have a chance to do the utmost, you go to the extreme. So what am I talking about practically? Well, there's two additional questions besides the personal statement. There's a disruption essay. That's an optional essay. There's the additional information. And then a lot of times you can send in what we call other recommenders, which are recommendations from somebody other than a classroom teacher. This could be a coach. This could be an employer. This could be a club leader. This could be on or off campus, by the way. It could be Girl Scouts, Eagle Scouts. There's a lot of different people that fit the bill of who this other recommender could be. And a lot of schools, if within the Common App, they rarely require it, but they'll oftentimes say optional, and you'll see a number like 5 or 3, 4, or 5. You're almost always better only having one other rec. You just have to be sensitive to the workload that you're putting on these very, very busy and overworked admission officers. Beth Heaton, a former admission officer at the University of Pennsylvania, tells a story that I think puts it really well. She talks about how when she was out all day visiting schools, a lot of times when you're on the road during travel season, you got to get in 4 or 5 school visits and maybe a fair in the night. You eat really late. And then there's a little bit of an overlap. You return your emails. There's a little bit of an overlap between travel season and reading season, especially for early applications. And then you come back and it's late at night and you got to read X number of files before you go to bed. When, as she puts it, you open that file and it's extra long, that is not helping the applicant. You just put more work onto the person that's got a really Herculean job already as it is. So the tip is just to be sensitive to not always doing everything extra. Now, it's a tricky when I say this because I always say if it comes to essays, typically, recommended should be required, in my opinion, and optional is highly, highly recommended in case it just doesn't apply to you. So I'm mostly talking here about your use of additional recommendations. I mean, most colleges can share horror stories of the record number that they've gotten or the amount that they even get from elementary or middle school teachers. That's the kind of stuff I'm saying. Do not do. And I'm going to come back and say something somewhat related to this again in the big number. All right, admissions vernacular. So this is somewhat along the theme. The last couple of weeks, Julia and I both did a part 1 and a part 2 of the big New York Times expose, Is Being Rich Its Own Admissions Qualification, and new data by Roz Chetty and his organization. That's pretty breathtaking. And last week's recommended resource was to attend the 30-minute webinar he did, which, by the way, was fantastic. I attended that. It was 30 minutes. It was really, really good. So this is somewhat sticking along those themes of privilege, but the term is the Z list. The Z list. Have you ever heard of the Z list, Dave?
I have not heard of the Z list. It sounds exclusive.
Well, you're right. You're right. It is exclusive. So schools typically don't promote programs like the Z list. It's usually clandestine, really under the table. But Harvard is kind of known for, it's out there and it's been out there for some time. Harvard's famous Z list. Well, what is this Z list? Well, first of all, let me just tell you a little bit about the history of the Z list because it's kind of got a interesting history. It goes back to actually the 1970s, although it never required that name until much later when some computer technicians in the office were the ones that coined the term. Marilyn McGrath, actually the director of admission at Harvard some time ago, came out and spoke about it in the student newspaper in 2002. And she said, we have 20 students admitted to the Z list. And then in 2010, Fitzsimmons, current director, been there for 50 plus years, said the number of students admitted to the Z list was between 30 and 50. And that's according to some reporting done by the New York Times. The number of Z-list students has climbed. In between 2014 and 2019, it got up to between 50 to 60 students annually. And so what is this Z-list? Well, A simple way of putting it is students that are not given a place in the fall admission class, but they are told that they will be given a spot in the following class after they've taken a gap year. And so, so Harvard doesn't have room for you, but we're going to make room for you the following year. So some people say, well, what's the big deal? Lots of schools have programs like that. I interviewed Sam Prouty a couple of years ago on the podcast from Middlebury, talking about their FEBIs, the famous FEBI program at Middlebury, where you take a semester off, and you have similar programs that are growing and spreading, and they're at a number of different institutions. It's a little different though between the traditional gap and how Harvard does their gap. And one of the things that caused Harvard's Z-list to have come under a lot of scrutiny is some of the research that came out from the SFFA, Dave, Students for Fair Admissions, about who actually is it that's getting on this Z-list in their lawsuit. So when you took a look, for example, at at that research that came out, white students were 70% of Z-list students, and black students were 2% of Z-list students. Legacy students, way, way, way overrepresented on the Z-list. And then full pay students, extremely overrepresented on the Z-list. And in fact, if you look at 2010, there were the Crimson actually did an interview with 28 Z-list students, and only 4 of them got any kind of financial aid. So traditionally, Z-list has been some really large donors who give gifts, and some highly connected students that the school wants, but they don't want them to show up in the admissions statistical profile. So they sneak them in the side door or the back door. And so that's really the Z-list. And are they the only ones? No. The Maroon, which is a UChicago paper, has come out in 2014 with an article talking about how the University of Chicago also has a Z-list. They have about 20 to 30 students that they've had. It's a much newer concept, hasn't been around as long as Harvard. Once again, people might say, well, isn't that the same as like Colorado College, Middlebury, that have their gap programs, where you take a breath and take a break and get some real world experience. The thing is, in these cases, students aren't waitlisted or Z-listed. They just take time off on their own volition through school sanctioned programs, and it's kind of part of their admission process. So it's kind of fallen under scrutiny because when you look at the academic ratings and profile of Z-list students, like their rating is so low. These are students that would not, really have a chance, through the regular admission process. So it's basically VIP and highly desirable applicants that Harvard wants to have in the school, but they don't want any sort of trace on them at all because they don't really show up anywhere statistically. They're a little bit invisible for anybody trying to.
So are these like really rich kids, really high
that's what it's been traditionally.
Athletes?
Traditionally it's been a high percentage of very, very wealthy families. That's what's given the Z-list its sort of notoriety. But it's not exclusively only that. Celebrity, just really connected people that it might be embarrassing for the school to have to say, how did this kid get through the process? And so it's kind of a way of doing it in a little bit more clandestine way. So all schools. Go ahead, Dave. I can see that smart aleck brain thinking over there, man. What's gonna come out of your mouth?
I'd say if I was a Javanka T. Jr.,
I know.
I might have a little inside ed on the Z-list there.
Maybe, just maybe. It's been written about a lot. If you read the Price of Admissions by investigative reporter Daniel Golden. So, Dave, I first heard about this when the famous book came out that talked a lot about this, and it really profiled some of the people that were getting in and some of their backgrounds and exposed it. And this is what Roz Chetty's been talking about, too, basically affirmative action for the wealthy and well-heeled and super connected. So thought that would be an interesting vernacular that I think a lot of people might not have heard of.
Yeah. They have to have a list for us. It'll be like the C list. We just be cool. Can we get in because we cool?
The A list, average.
Average, yeah.
All right. So our big number, I said I would come back to the same theme. I mentioned earlier, I really, really liked the University of Chicago info session I attended on the 12th of July. I'm going to be actually drawing quite a few things out of that and sharing with you, bit by bit here and there on the podcast. But one of the things that the senior leader shared was she had everybody guess and go around and say, how many pages is an average application? What do you think, Dave?
Oh, good one. This is not including the actual forms. You're just talking about the written applications that the
No, this would be everything. So when you have a file, you read everything. You're going to see, the recommendations, and you're going to see all the essay writing. And how many pages do you think an average application is?
I would say 50 to 75.
Not that much, because remember, they're taking 7 minutes to read everything on average.
Oh, really? Okay. All right.
Yeah.
20 to 30.
Okay, 30, right on. So
Okay.
30, and so yeah, and actually, she was saying this in the context of, so you don't need to send tons and tons and tons of extra stuff because we're already, reading 30 pages on each student. And so that's the big number, 30. That's how many pages are in the average application at the University of Chicago. And I would say that number would be very similar, because that was my guess when we did it, was 30, and I wasn't putting any more emphasis on the University of Chicago. So that's pretty typical for a school that has, some additional college-specific things that you have to do. So just be sensitive not to put undue weight on your admission officers by, the whole thing they say, Dave, sometimes less is more.
Yes.
All right, Dave. Well, this is, I'm actually really excited about this. But first of all, it's been 2 months since you and I have done one of these, but
That's
this
right.
is an interesting topic, and I take it away, my friend.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
This is Admitting the Top 10% for Geographic Diversity, an article by Doug Lederman in Inside Higher Ed. And it's about the University of South Carolina's plan to admit top 10% of students from state public high schools. Texas did this when its colleges couldn't consider race. South Carolina officials say that race is not their motivation. So, in the lead up to the U.S. Supreme Court's decisions restricting consideration of race in colleges, college leaders strategized publicly and privately about how they might alter their policies and practices if justice limited the use of affirmative action. Among the commonly cited possibilities was adopting an approach used in Texas and Florida, in which public colleges guaranteed admission to the top percentile of every high school in the state. Well, barely a month after the Supreme Court's rulings, the University of South Carolina flagship campus at Columbia said it would do just that. Said President Michael Amaritis in a news release, by welcoming the top 10% of our state's high school graduates, we are reinforcing our commitment to access and excellence in education for South Carolina citizens. But South Carolina officials say that despite the proximity of their announcement to the Supreme Court's actions, their policy was not motivated by race. Quote, this is not a race or diversity strategy. It's more of a geographic strategy, said one official. Well, while many of this country's most selective flagship universities, such as the University of Virginia and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, have historically used race as a factor in admissions, South Carolina admits roughly 60% of its undergraduate applicants and does not consider race in its admissions, though it does have different strategies for recruiting students of different races, said one of its deans. More than half of South Carolinians who rank in the top 10% of their classes already apply to the Columbia campus, but they aren't equitably dispersed geographically. There are counties in the state where they get 30 applications from each county, even though active recruitment goes on. So the university wants to increase its enrollment, and one of the ways of doing so is to increase the number of South Carolina residents that apply to the university across the board. The flagship's pandemic-driven move to test optional admissions, which gave the institution a ready-made pilot program to compare the academic performance of those who had submitted test scores with those who had not, helped persuade its officials that it could guarantee admission to students in the top 10% of their classes without any diminution in outcomes. They found there was almost no difference in the performance in first-year grades between those that were test optional and those that submitted their scores. So, South Carolina hopes that its new approach will encourage students at high schools that currently send few of their students to the flagship to consider it. Quote, we'll be able to tell them if you apply and meet the requirements, we guarantee you'll be admitted. We hope that it will give the state of students, this strata of students, some certainty. So let me stop there, Mark, and see, what do you think about South Carolina's strategy, and is it a model for other colleges going forward?
So what's really interesting about this, Dave, is, of course, this decision came out right after the affirmative action decision. And so the natural reflexive reaction is to think that this is a creative attempt to try to get more racial diversity in the University of South Carolina. But that's actually not the case. I'll read a quote from an official here. South Carolina officials say, despite proximity to the announcement of the Supreme Court's action, referring to affirmative action, the policy was not motivated by it. This is not a race or diversity strategy. It's a geographic strategy. Scott Verzel, the VP of Enrollment and the Dean of Undergraduate Admissions at South Carolina, said in an interview. And so this is very different than when Texas went to its 10% plan, which then became the 7% plan and the 6% plan. That was mostly motivated to increase racial diversity. South Carolina has never really practiced affirmative action. They were one of the last schools to integrate. And even now, 35% of the state is black and only 8% of the university is black. So it's never really been something that's been prioritized. There's always been that, recruiter, individuals, and sometimes even directors that have cared about that. But it's never been the philosophy. Remember, state schools set their policies oftentimes by the board of regents, not even on an individual school level. So then the reason why I wanted to take this up, and I have to shout out to Michelle Silberger from Michelle Silbernagle from Washington State, a college counselor. She sent this in to us. She's a real friend of the show and a big supporter. So what I liked about this, because a new thing we haven't really talked about before, and I always like new things we haven't talked about. So what's going on here? So what's going on can be somewhat captured by a conversation that I had with Mary Wagner less than a year ago. So Mary Wagner had been the VP of Enrollment at South Carolina, and she left about a year ago this time to go to the College Board, and we met at the College Board conference and had a chance to talk to her. So I was asking her whether she ever anticipated South Carolina doing what Georgia Tech, the University of Virginia, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Texas, Michigan, Wisconsin, and the UCs do. What do you think that is, Dave? Any idea?
Not sure.
They put a cap on out-of-state student. They put a
cap
yes,
that makes sense.
Yeah. So it goes from as little as 8% at Texas. I missed another one in that list, Florida. So you got 8% out of state at Texas, 10% out of state at Florida, 18% for UNC Chapel Hill, and for University of California, San Diego, UCLA, and Berkeley. They're all at 18%. Georgia, 20% out of state cap. And it kind of goes up from there, where you have like closer to a third, 33 for the University of Virginia. And then Michigan does this 51-49 thing, where a majority, like 50.1, have to be from the state of Michigan. Wisconsin, 55-45. So what do all those states have in common? Let's just look at them. University of Texas, Austin, University of Florida, University of Georgia. Oh, I never mentioned Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech does 30%. Georgia Tech, UNC, Chapel Hill, Wisconsin, Michigan, and the UCs. Those are like the most selective public schools in the country, right? Yeah. So you have this dynamic that happens where parents are like, why am I paying all these tax dollars and my kid can't get in their own state school? So then you put pressure on the politicians and then you get policies in place. So I was talking with Mary Wagner and I said to her, do you anticipate South Carolina ever doing that? And she said, oh my goodness, no. And the reason why, she said, is we just don't have enough residents to support Clemson, USC, the flagship school in Columbia, we're talking about here, and then another really big and popular school, College of Charleston. We're just too small of a state. So she compared them more to what you see from two other flagships, the University of Delaware and the University of Vermont, who aggressively recruit out of state because their states are so small and they need out of state residents. You also see that with Alabama as well. So she said, so no, oh my goodness, no, we don't. So South Carolina has emerged in recent years as one of the leaders, along with Alabama and Tennessee and a few others, at having the most regional admission officers all around the country. You know what I mean by regionals, Dave?
Well, yeah, those are officers that are selected to go to specific geographic areas. So, for example, you would have a Northwest region.
So let me explain it because it's a little confusing. So there's admission officers. Almost all admission offices divide the country and even the world into territories, right? And so there is a regional admission officer that's responsible for the Chicago market. Like I know the one that Lauren worked with that worked the Chicago market. So those are regional territory managers. But usually when we use the term regionals, we're referring to people that live in the place where they're recruiting. So they're not based out of where the school is.
Right.
So Alabama leads the country with, it varies every year, 43, 45, 46 regionals. They're literally stationed all over. So I know they have two that work the Atlanta market. They got them Chicago, they got them all over. And that's how they're now more than 60% out of state. So it's been a growing trend. When we have Fabrizio on from the University of Tennessee, he's coming on here, he's going to talk about this, how University of Tennessee has really successfully used their regionals to drive their application numbers up, and especially out of state. So South Carolina has been a leader at that. And schools do it for a couple of reasons. One is, especially in conservative states where they're less likely to want to have tax increases that go to higher ed, you got to get the money somehow. So you can turn to out-of-state students that you can charge double or triple or 2.5 times the tuition. And even if you throw a merit scholarship back, you're still getting way more than an in-state kid. So in some cases, it's a lot of cases, it's a financial move. If you don't feel like you have enough students in your state to come in your school, it could be even a survival move just to get more students. And then it also can be more geographic diversity. That can be more appealing, right? So, I mean, you look at a place like Texas A&M that doesn't do this. 95% of the students come from Texas at Texas A&M. University of Alabama, it's almost 2/3 out of state. So some schools also like the geographic diversity piece. So South Carolina has been a leader on that. So when you combine that, Dave, with an article you and I discussed maybe 4 or 5 months ago about the trend toward students attending Southern schools, remember that?
Yep. Yes, I do.
So what it has produced is this mindset within the state of, I'm not going to get in there. They are more interested in the out-of-state kid.
Right.
So this 10% move is not about racial diversity. It's about ensuring people in the state that you don't have to be intimidated by the fact that you're hearing that so many people are coming in from out of state. Because all of a sudden, these schools like Tennessee and South Carolina, I'm telling you, they are so much more popular, like in places like New Jersey and New York and Pennsylvania and even into New England than they ever were before. So then the buzz gets out and the word gets out, oh, why should I even apply? I'm probably not going to get in there. They'd rather have whatever, Midwesterners and Northerners or whatever. So when that sort of seeps into the consciousness, then you even have a harder problem recruiting people, especially from rural areas and from places that are not coming from, your more well-resourced, affluent suburbs. So it's just a killer, because already a lot of times schools don't travel to those places as much just because
Yeah.
especially depending on how remote you are. You know, it may be a long drive and you only can visit one school a day versus 4 or 5. It's hard sometimes, unless you're super committed to that recruiting there, it's hard to have as many visits, and it's not as much of a college-going culture. And so this is an attempt basically for them to drum up in-state applicants, especially from harder to reach in-state areas, by just flat out giving them a guarantee and saying, we're going to remove all the stigma of, am I going to get in? You can just look, and if you're in the top 10%, then you're in. And even for independent schools, you've got to have a school size of at least 20. And then, like most flagships, South Carolina also has some satellite campuses as well. Right? And the satellite campuses, they're not as selective, but the same concept applies there. And so what South Carolina has done for their satellite campuses is they have made it a top 20% rather than a top 10% for people that are attending any of the, I mean, I sometimes think I should probably talk to somebody at one of these campuses. I have a feeling they might not like that term, satellite campuses. I probably need a better term for it, but it's like alternative campuses other than the flagship. So do you remember reading that in the article, Dave, where it talked about the...
I didn't remember that, but I am familiar with the concept of the satellite campuses, though. I remember when we talked about UNC at Asheville,
right? And
there's
a lot of different UNCs,
yeah,
right? Greensboro,
and how
Wilmington, and
having been to Asheville quite a few times, I've actually driven through that campus, and what a great little campus that was. And you got the UNC name, and right up in the mountains in a beautiful area. So
yeah. So they have 3 other campuses that are affiliated with the University of South Carolina, other than the flagship. So yeah, I should probably call them, what oftentimes they're referred to in South Carolina, comprehensive universities within the USC system. So the other schools are USC Aiken, USC Beaufort, and USC Upstate.
Yeah.
So what they're doing is they're doing something similar, but they don't draw usually as strong a student as the flagship does. So they're doing guaranteed admissions if you're ranked in the top 20% of your class. So this basically extending throughout the whole USC comprehensive system to all of the schools. And one of the interesting things in this article, though, Dave, is this was done after they looked at research and showed that students that they had admitted in the top 10% without test scores were performing with similar GPAs to those with test scores. And it gave them confidence that they don't need test scores in order to make admissions decisions. Here's a quote from another article, actually, not the one that you read, but one from the U.S., right from South Carolina's website. Studies currently show that high school grades and class rank are better predictors for success than standardized test scores, says Scott Verzel, USC President, Enrollment Management and Dean of Admissions. Students with strong high school GPAs who are South Carolina residents who have a class rank are prepared for college and will be successful. And the article goes on to show that they tested it out and looked at students that they admitted without test scores and looked at their GPA. And that's when they came away and said, okay, we can do this. So,
yeah,
we haven't really talked about this, but it's an opportunity. It's an example of how schools use creativity. I'm going to be talking coming up about something Wake Forest is doing that's super creative to attract students that tend to not apply at the rates that schools would like to see them apply it. Any thoughts?
Yeah, and I think the other thing the article illustrates, and it's interesting because I was reading through the threads that we actually exchanged with the other people on our podcast, is that outside of the top 50 schools, yield is a really major thing. And people don't realize how difficult it is for colleges to actually maintain the students in this era when there's a declining number of students and they're scrambling. And so, when you have South Carolina, they're not turning away students. They're trying to encourage students. They're trying to fill those slots. And they're looking at untapped markets. And when they see solid kids from their own state, top 10%, going other universities because they didn't reach out. That's a financial loss for them, and it's also a moral loss because they realize that they're having a hard time filling their classes and they're missing out on some great students right in their backyard. So it's just to illustrate to everybody that despite all this sense that, oh my goodness, it's harder than ever to get into schools and that I'm not going to find a great fit, that's just simply not the case.
Yeah, Dave's referring to all of our podcast co-hosts. We have a very robust group text message where we always throw out articles with each other and discuss things and just sharpen each other through the week. So that's what Dave was referring to. There was a lot of talk in our text message group around yield. Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about yield in our text message group. And, Dave, I'll even go one step further. I mean, when, like even your most highly selective schools struggle with yield because sure, their yield rate is higher than less selective schools, but if you're getting into, Vanderbilt, like you're getting into a lot of other places that are brand name and you have choices.
Yeah, I remember you guys talking about Vanderbilt and you think, oh, Vandy, it has no problems, but its yields dropped to like 50% and they thought that was catastrophic. And that one of the text persons said that when you look at all the tricks that even the most selective schools are employing, such as early decision 1 and early decision 2, and all the ways
and
that they
ED3, either use of waitlist to do ED3.
Absolutely. And all to make sure that they buff their stats for that mystical, bogus U.S. News ranking every year.
Well, here's the thing, Dave. It's not really just about that. Like I can't be very critical because when I was in admissions, I was very yield conscious. Like you have a job to do.
Yeah.
Right. It's either heads and beds if you're at a point where you're just struggling just for survival. But it's also, if you're not a school that's struggling for survival, it's heads and beds and you want to be able to show all of the people that are evaluating you, all of your stakeholders, whoever that might be, from the boards to the president to the alumni to faculty, the provost, to students, to parents, to, all the constituencies. Like, if you're a moderately selective school, a very selective school, they're going to be like, of course you can fail. Failing is nothing. I want to see qualitative indicators that you're making this school better than before. So that's what puts the pressure on you, right? And so people look at different things. Like some people look at simple things like average test scores or things like admit rates, or they might look at things like your compositional diversity. They might look at things like how many states, how many countries, how many first gen, how many Pell recipients, students of color, just different schools are different. Some schools publish things like percentage of kids that were top of their class or top 10% of their class. Like all those qualitative metrics are all things that are used to show me that I'm going to know you're doing a good job if you can prove to me that you're improving the caliber of our student body every year. And that gets harder when people are applying to more and more and more schools every year. That makes yield much, much more difficult, even to keep up with what you've done before.
And I got to say, Mark, that if they ever published a list of the most stressful or difficult jobs, I expect that being a college admission counselor is right up there with an air traffic controller. Because when you look at all these, and you've mentioned it, I've read it,
really is.
There is more turnover now, I think, in the college admissions field than almost maybe than an inner city McDonald's. I don't know. You're replacing
only you would think that. Only you would think of that one.
It's like, yeah, we got him for a week. That was good. That was a good run for that kid. But yeah, I can't imagine being an admission counselor with all these competing demands. And I think the more that you have structural things like admitting the top 10% or 20% to just help you bring in more of that yield, the more pressure it takes off to try and fill with all these impossible competing demands.
Well, here's another good point about yield as it relates to this. One thing that schools that sometimes yield is actually quite high, it can be the flagship schools or sometimes these other comprehensive schools, because a lot of times the student they're attracting, where they're drawing from is like right from their immediate area. And it's easier to actually yield that student than expect that student to travel 300 or 400 miles away. So, part of the argument for doing this is it helps serve all of our state, but it's like, this is a low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit are in-state students who don't want to leave the state, who would want to come here, but they're just not applying because they don't think they're going to get in, because they're hearing of, all these out-of-state students are coming in. I don't think they want us. Now, the state of Georgia did something very, very interesting similar to this some time ago. Because obviously any state that's growing is, experiencing a lot more applications every year. And then Georgia has the Hope Scholarship. So, it's really kept the majority of the talented students in state overwhelming. I've shared this stat once before. I'll share it again. Before the Hope Scholarship was launched in 93, 75% of students that had a 1400 SAT left Georgia. Now 75% stay in Georgia. Like, that's been the change. That's drastic, especially with a growing state. And so where do they want to go? They want to go to Georgia Tech. So that's been intimidating for, like South Carolina. Georgia's got, large rural section, and those students, they're oftentimes, a lot of times, first gen. Though even the concept of college is a little bit intimidating to them, and they may not always feel welcome. They may not get as many visitors and cultivation, because you're going to get a lot more return for your investment if you come into work the Atlanta market, or even other places like, Augusta, Columbus, the second and third biggest cities. So what Georgia did to address this, Dave, is they said, if you are valedictorian or salutatorian, then you're automatically in Georgia Tech. Now, there's a few caveats. One of them is, look, your school can't be 3 people, can't have somebody start and launching a school with 12 kids and to get valedictorians and salutatorians. Like, there's a few caveats in place. But this was it's the same concept. It's designed to help people get kids from like the 155 small little counties out there that oftentimes don't even have a single kid coming from the entire county. And it's kind of worked, because I know Georgia, like over 800 kids in the incoming class were valedictorian or salutatorian. And so it's just another strategic way of signaling to people that tend to be, it's more difficult to get them to apply, that you're welcome here and you have a spot.
Right.
Any final comments?
No, I think, once again, it makes a lot of sense. I think it's a trend that's going to definitely grow. As there are 5 or 6 states that have the luxury of having to limit their class sizes, but there are 50 states out there, and I think there are 35 plus states that are really struggling to fill to meet their needs. And I think this is one great way to do it. Harvest from your own backyard. So I expect to see this trend to grow.
Yeah, and even that, a pretty high percentage of people in South Carolina that are in the top 10% already apply to USC. The admit rate has been 60%. South Carolina admits roughly 60% of its undergraduate population. So, you know what I mean? It's not like a Texas, or it's just a killer to get in, or Georgia Tech, or the UCs, or, some of the, UVA and some of those, schools that are really, really hard, Chapel Hill. But hopefully this was helpful. And I think you're right. I absolutely think you're right. Like, one thing, if there's one good thing, I think, Dave, that's come out of the affirmative action decision, is going to be a whole lot more creativity. Yeah. And I hesitate to say this because I really firmly believe this was not motivated by the affirmative action decision. That was just coincidental that the decision was released within a month. Dave, just one more thing, just to reinforce the commitment to try to reach unreached groups. Here's another quote from the article. It says, there are counties in the state that we get fewer than 30 applicants from, even though we recruit there. So it's kind of an acknowledgement that we're not being successful at penetrating certain portions of the state. So let's see if this incentivizes people.
Okay, great.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Good morning, Mark. How are you?
Good. Excited to grab another speak pipe question with you. Listeners, before we got on, you and I were talking about how, sometimes our answers will be slightly different just because our clients are different and who we're serving. And so we try to have a mixture of just different people, different backgrounds as co-hosts so you can get different perspectives. And generally speaking, we don't talk about these before. Like we prepare ourselves and we come on and you never know where it's going to go.
Yep.
In terms of, what Julie might say, or I mean, we're going to be in agreement the overwhelming majority of times, but you are slightly getting different perspectives. And this may be one of them. So anything you want to say before we play this question, Julia?
I just like to give a little background and often listeners, I'm asking Mark for a lot of advice as well, and some of the other co-hosts, because we all have sort of different touch points in different areas. But just a warning to the listeners that as a school-based counselor, the overwhelming majority of the students I work with, beyond maybe like 5 other students that I meet through College Horizons or the Mountain School or something else, but that we have, as a boarding school that I work at, we have a very sort of specific background where a lot of our students are very wealthy, and then a lot of our students are sort of at the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum, so might qualify for QuestBridge, certainly qualify for fee waivers for tests and applications. And actually, believe it or not, we have a smaller middle class section at my school. So often, sometimes the conversations are very much at either end of the spectrum when we're talking about sort of trends and processes, where that, the majority of my students might have 2 different pathways rather than a bunch of different ones.
Yeah, and a few things. I know that Julia, just from, working with her for 5 to 6 years in our friendship, she does have, people on both sides of that spectrum. Like on the lower side, I think they'll often seek you out because they find you to be simpatico and a voice of understanding and compassion, and just somebody, I think, who's got empathy. So I know that you definitely have those relationships. I know that when Julia talks about the middle group, it's important to know that we're not talking about middle income in U.S. terms, like the median income is 68,000 in the country, right? You're talking more like when you and I did the conversation on being rich is its own new qualification, and they talked about the group between 68 and 618
Yes.
as the group that's having some negative disparate incomes in this, or results in this process. So you're talking about that. You don't have a lot in that group. You have a lot of under 68 and north of 613 in your population.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's really helpful, just to have a little bit of that background, because a lot of our listeners are going to fall in that group, are going to fall in that middle group.
Exactly.
Just based on our survey that we did with over 200 respondents, where people did, share their income. Now, we do have that higher end group too, though. That's one reason also why I want you on here, because we also have that group that's quite wealthy and that is very much aspiring to 15 to 20 schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, you have an important voice on that, but I don't want people to know that you also do represent the other side. So without any further ado, enough about us.
Yeah.
Let's play a question that I got really excited about when it came in. All right, Julia, let's do what we've consistently done. Tell me how you would answer this question, and then I'll throw in anything else that I would share, and then maybe we'll have a little chit chat. And what are we calling this listener? Upstate New York listener?
Yeah, let's do that.
Hello. I've so enjoyed learning from you all with your podcast and website and college spotlights. I'm a fairly new listener, but I already feel like part of the YCBK family that you talk about regularly, and now listen to every podcast shortly after it drops. All of this information has been so valuable to me in my quest to help my son, a rising senior, to build a college list and for me to better understand the current college landscape. My son will likely apply to 10 or so colleges in the fall, some of which are highly selective and others that are less so. Affordability is the number one consideration for our family. So here's my question. How much should I be part of my son's application process? Because cost is critical for our family, I have felt that I need to be intimately involved in the college selection process, and I've done considerable research to assess affordability and best fit, including major campus culture, and since the recent podcast we did about the housing shortage, I'm also now looking at that. My son has been less involved in the process, but is very willing to consider colleges I've selected based on these criteria. So while my son tells me he's tired of talking about college, feels that he's got it all figured out, for some reason, I'm still struggling with how I can best help. I've noticed that when you ask your guests to give advice to parents, it's usually to back off, and I totally get this. I want my son to feel the reward from his efforts. Can you give me an idea of what a good balance would be for the coming fall semester and to help him juggle all the requirements of the admissions process?
So what would be your response here?
I really feel for upstate New York here. I think this is actually one of the more difficult parts of the college process. And on one hand, everyone's really excited and you want everything for your child. And on the other side, there's the realities of affording college, this day and age. It is totally within your right to be, I think, to be a large presence in this part of the conversation. You're correct in that we do advise that parents take a back seat to the student's college process in the sense that the student should be driving the process. But it is a family decision when it comes to affording college, and therefore your realities very much need to be a factor in this. Our students, for a lot of our families, we actually encourage, and there's not a lot of chatter about this out there, and I hope that this will change in the next 10 years, but the sort of best outcomes we have seen, and we've sort of seen from research and experts in this field, is that actually starting the conversation as early as possible with your child about affording college, maybe not applying to college, maybe not what kind of colleges, or kind of, planting the seed about, oh, high school's about preparing for college, but more about the realities of your finances. So that way, when you get to this part of the process, everyone's sort of on the same page. Now, I would say the majority of people, including myself, we don't operate like that. Actually, I'm usually starting this conversation about affording college in the junior year. And so for those families that are just kind of getting into the process, but finances are very much a reality, is we talk to the student about a few things. We have the student and the parent sit down together and do a net price calculator at a few different colleges. We might do one at a very generous college for financial aid, and that might be often a reach school, sometimes not even in reach. And then maybe a state school, and then an out-of-state school, public university, and then maybe also a private school that provides some financial aid, but not a lot. And that way the student can kind of start to see sort of the breakdown of just how expensive an education is. And so sort of just like building a list in terms of where someone might get in, we really encourage the student to put financial likelies, but also maybe really great schools that have strong programming and what the student's looking for, but some significant merit aid opportunities. So I know a lot of my students, especially if they're in that sort of middle income to high middle income, basically just below the 1%ers in that bracket, where you may get a very small amount of need base, but the sweet spot might be that merit aid that can sometimes amass to, 25,000 off or something like that. We really encourage students to list some of those schools. And also a lot of the time that would mean that you're going to be a very competitive applicant for that college as well. So trying to think about along the list, sort of, what are some financial fits and what are some sort of return on investment, as well as discounted, if you will, sort of opportunities. Just because a college is really expensive and provides no merit aid does not mean it's the best college, right? So, and many times my students actually cannot attend their first choice college because of finances. Even if they maybe could swing it, but it'd be difficult, but they got a significant merit aid package at another college. I have never had a student come back to me and say like, oh gosh, in the end, I wish I had chosen that school that was very expensive and I didn't get anything off. I've had a lot of students who choose like a Canadian school over an Ivy League, or a state school over, really reputable private school. And all of them have come back to me really happy with their decision. And I talk about this a lot too. I will also say, being in debt after you graduate, if you can, personal experience as well, if you can really limit that, like I see this as your ability as a parent to make sure your child can be successful financially after they graduate. And so please take that line if you need to, and that having something that's unaffordable that will either affect your family or affect the financial outcome of your child after they graduate, that is not good for anyone in their future. So 4 years should not dictate the rest of your financial reality.
Yeah, I was really, really happy this question came in, and we're calling this listener Upstate New York because we never got a name, so that's okay. Some people prefer anonymous, or some people even use pseudonyms, whatever you want. So I really like this question a lot for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons is because in the back of my mind, I have sometimes felt like we have not put enough emphasis on the fact that this is a joint decision.
Yes.
And when we talk about like parents, students driving the process, sometimes we're overreacting to that over-involved parent
Right.
that meddles with everything, and we're speaking to that person. And I do not mean to imply the parent is passive in this process at all. Not at all. In fact, I think it's a mistake to do so on a number of levels. Give an example. So just last night, I was in a session with a student from New Jersey and the parents, and I know enough about the situation to know that like money's not a non-factor here. And so the student says to me, like, can you go over like all the advantages of applying early decision? And he sort of was going in the direction of sort of helping me, guiding me toward what should be a good early decision school, that you're going to go in that direction, right? And so I started by saying, okay, like, first of all, pump the brakes, because I was in the session with mom and dad. I said, what you need to understand is early decision is a family decision. Parents have to be incredibly involved in this, because in this case, they weren't going to qualify for aid, but it was going to be extremely hard to pay the amount, and Julie does deal with a lot of families like that. I don't want to make it sound like you don't have anywhere. And you alluded to that, where paying the full amount is going to be incredibly painful.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing I said was, as a student, you really don't know how much money that is. Your parents do.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have to have buy-in on whether or not they're willing to commit to a school. Price unknown. No, I mean, they may know a net price calculator or something and know that, okay, we're going to get no or little or not an amount of aid that we need. But you're giving up your ability to see what another school offers. Like, so many schools do what we call, auto aid, and they give a financial aid award automatically. They use your admission application as your scholarship application, and then all of a sudden you get an award. You're giving up your ability to compare that. So first and foremost, you have to have a long conversation with your parents to see if that's okay. I'm just bringing that up because that just literally just happened last night. On so many different levels, I feel strongly. I'll stay in the financial lane for a little bit more, and then I want to broaden it out. So, in that book I wrote, 171 Answers to the Most Asked College Admissions Questions, chapter 21 of that book, and I'm saying this partly because when we first started the podcast, we had a book section in every single episode. So we literally had 5 sections. We had in the news, we had the book chapter, we also had a question from a listener in the interview and the spotlight. And we just went all the way through my book. Nika was co-host with me all the way through 171 episodes. So literally you could go to episode 21 because we had the chapters coincide with the book titles. So chapter 21 of the book is called How Can I Do a Self-Assessment of What My Family Can Really Afford to Pay? And so I'm really big on that. I'm really big on a family going all the way through the process. And I just had a family do this, and they were surprised. They found $15,000 more that they didn't know that they had. Because part of going all the way through the process means you look at every single expense you're paying in high school that you're not going to pay in college. And that's possible money that could be freed up for your budget. So you got to look at everything. Okay, what am I paying for this camp and for this dance lesson and for this travel softball and, all of the different fees, food. And I'm even big at even looking all the way down to your electrical and water bill, like factor it all in.
Yep.
And then look at your budget. And, I'm not going to repeat that whole thing, but I encourage you to go back and look at that. But the point is, families have to do that. Parents have to do that. And parents have a right to veto any school over money because they're paying.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm big on telling people we're looking for 4 fits. We talk about the academic fit, but a lot of time the focus is on that academic fit. And we get into that. Is the school good in my major? What's the teaching style and what's the class size and all that kind of stuff related to academic fit. We talk about social fit a fair amount and is it the kind of culture that I'm looking for and will I be happy here? I like to talk about emotional fit, meaning is it going to be healthy? But that other fit is financial fit, and you're looking for fit in all areas, academic, social, emotional, and financial. Only parents can really do that. Kids don't have any sense at all of money.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're the overwhelming majority of families that cannot afford to pay full sticker price at all schools, then it's really irresponsible, one, not, like Julia said, not to talk about money and talk about it early, which is very important because kids usually respond to boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And once you give them a boundary, most kids will understand that. It's when you come in at the last second with a sledgehammer and say, oh, we can't pay that amount, and you made your kid think you could. That's when you have a problem.
Right.
So you want to talk early about money, but you want to establish clear boundaries. You might have heard me say this, Julia, but I often say this to families. So in Atlanta, we have a very wealthy section known as Buckhead. Julia knows this all too well because she went to Emory and lived here in the area.
Mm-hmm.
And I oftentimes say to families that you wouldn't drive into Buckhead with your kid, drive around and say, pick out the most expensive house and I'll pay for it. Like, you wouldn't do that.
No.
But that's the equivalent of what sometimes people end up doing in the college process.
Exactly.
I used to do this workshop when I was at KIPP, which is a charter school I worked with for 14 years. I used to do financial parent workshops for the parents about paying for college every year. And I used to have the parents say, repeat after me. And this thing I would have them say, repeat after me. So many people would come up to me afterwards and say that was so helpful. And what I'd have them say, repeat after me, is the following. I'd have them say, I am not, then they'd have to chant, I am not. And then I would say, a bad parent, because I impose financial restrictions on how much we're willing to pay for college. That does not make you a bad parent. That makes you a responsible parent. And that's one of the biggest places that leads to a lot of debt. Because there's this myth out here that if I don't let my kid go to their dream school and pay whatever amount the school says I have to pay, then I'm a bad parent. And I'm trying to debunk that every step of the way. That's insane. That's crazy talk for certain schools. And then what so many parents do is they outsource that to their kid. Well, it's wherever they want to go. Well, kids have no understanding at all about money. So this is just one area, and I know that upstate New York asked for this more broadly, so I want to answer it more broadly. But I do want to say that when it comes to the financial piece, that's a piece where parents have to seize control. They have to figure out what's the max that they are comfortable paying. Other conversations you need to be having with your student are they going to work during the school year? If so, what do you expect them to contribute? Are they going to work during the summer? What do you expect them to contribute? Are they going to take out student loans? How much student loans? Are we taking out loans? Are we comfortable tapping into home equity? Or God forbid, our retirement? Do we expect you, the student, to live on or off campus? Like, all these things are kinds of things that people need to be talking about. And a lot of times people aren't comfortable about money. So you don't have this conversation, or they start the college process too late. So that's the money piece. But I want to answer it more broadly as well. There's a lot of things parents can do. A lot of things parents can do in the process. And I'll just mention some, but I will say this. It's going to take on a different form for different families. So that's really important. Part of it is your skill set as a parent. Some of it is your time. And some of it is in your approach to parenting. So this is not a one size fits all. I'll just mention some of the things that either a parent should consider doing, or, this is really what a parent needs to do. Like, I would say parent needs to grab ownership of this. I'll do one in the financial, and then we'll get off the financial. So when you look at the financial aid forms, FAFSA, free application for federal student aid, CSS profile, what's called the profile, those are in the student's name. However, you're asking yourself for all kinds of errors if you outsource that completely to your student.
Yes.
It's going to be asking you questions about W-2s and tax returns and all kinds of things, assets. So I'm a big believer of one of two options, actually. The student and the parent do it together, because that's going to have the student take on the ownership and understand it's in their name.
Yep.
But the parent can answer those questions without errors, much more likely than the student is to be able to do that.
Right.
And if I have my choice between student only or parent only, I'm going for parent only.
Right. Agreed.
So that's one thing that I would say the parent absolutely should be involved in. Another great place a parent can be involved in is all the planning of trips. Okay, there may be airline tickets, there may be hotels, working on logistics, rent-a-cars, all that stuff. Definitely a really good place for most of the time. That's going to be something a parent is going to do. Some other things that I find really helpful for a parent to do, and some of this is going to depend on whether or not you're working with like an independent, educational counselor, college coach, or someone like Julia, an independent school college counselor with a small caseload that can really get involved in some things. It's versus if you're at a large public. So, and some of it just applies no matter what. So I find a good thing a parent can do is brainstorm with their kids all their activities and their awards, because there's an activity section and there's a award section. And a lot of times, even when I'm working with the family, I'll be like, let's talk to your parents, see what they may remember that you may not remember, because most people don't start in 8th or 9th and chronicle all this stuff.
Right.
Very few people do that. It would make it easier to do the honors in the award section, but very few people do that. So that's a really great thing for parents to be involved in, that brainstorming of all the different activities you've done, looking at your awards. Julia, this is something I just started doing this year, and you understand at a board, so you're probably not doing this, but it's been really helpful. So when it comes to working with students on their essays, that is, when I'm into the nitty gritty of essays, that is the one time that I have a policy, parents are not welcome in there.
Right.
In fact, you want to know what grinds my gears is when I work with a student all the way on an essay, and then a parent comes in at the last second and wants to make all these changes.
Blows it up. Yes.
It's happened to me twice this week.
Oh no.
Yeah, and in one case, and you regular listeners know that I'm a straight shooter, it was a doctor, and I said, how would you feel if you prescribed a medicine, and not only did like Aunt Becky or someone come in and say, no, I don't think that medicine is good, you should use my secret potion,
right,
but you want Aunt Becky to go to the doctor and tell the doctor to start using your prescription.
Yeah.
So the parent backed off on that. And then another time I said, when you take your car into the mechanic, do you trust the mechanic, or do you hover over them and start saying, "Oh, I really think you need to be working on the transmission"? So that's a pet peeve of mine. However, and what I've started doing is actually encouraging parents to be in this initial brainstorming session. So we have students fill out these brainstorming exercises where we identify 2 to 3 topics that we think would be great at telling their story, and then we let the student pick which one do you have the most passion on. But I've actually found it helpful to have the parent in that session because of their knowledge of their student.
Yes.
They've been making some really good suggestions about things that they know that I don't know. As much as I gather all this data and have people fill out this stuff, I still haven't lived with them for 16, 17 years.
Right.
So that's been a new thing that I've started doing. It's been actually really helpful. This is going to vary from student to student and from person to person. But if there are some parents that play a role in proofing, like if you're not working with somebody, when it comes to proofing essays and things like that, sometimes parents are a thought partner there. You know, when I have students that pursue outside scholarships, I like them to have a scholarship partner because I find they need that accountability.
Yes.
And sometimes that's best being another peer, like another friend in theirs. They're going for outside scholarships and they say, hey, we're going to do one a week. And they, you know, but sometimes a parent works well in that. It just really depends on the relationship the student has with the parent. You know, so there are a lot of different places where a parent can play a role. Sometimes even as a sounding board, you know. The reason why we oftentimes talk about parent, student in the driver's seat, parent in the passenger seat, is because a lot of times we see people cross the line.
Right.
And we see people who, and I'm talking about parents, I say people, let me be more direct. The way I like to put it is they see their child, they don't just live vicariously through their child. Everybody does that to some extent. There's a healthy and unhealthy way of doing that. But they see their child as their chance at a career do-over. I should have been a doctor. I should have been an entrepreneur. I should have been a, you know, whatever. And now they direct their child to do that. Or sometimes I'm uncomfortable with parents who say, they really start dictating to their student, like, I'm not paying for college for this major versus that major, and things like that.
Right.
And so we see a fair number of those abuses that oftentimes we're speaking to that exception. So, Joey, I've been kind of going on here on a monologue. Anything you want to add about, like, any thoughts you said about different roles that I see a parent? And by the way, the things I shared were by no means exhaustive, but those are just some of the areas where I see that parents can really play an integral role. And I think it is ultimately a joint decision.
Yes.
You know, any comments you have on anything I said or anything else you want to say?
Completely agree on that. And I've even seen, we have my clientele is very eager parents. And I think also on top of maybe the boarding aspect, you feel like you really aren't involved in your child's process sometimes, but that actually a lot of those tips, Mark, that you gave have really been helpful. I had a boarding, your parents like bragging about you. So oftentimes they will come up with some pieces or maybe some growth pieces that someone like your counselor would not be privy to, like the time you actually had a difficult time going to sleepaway camp and learned all these skills about taking care of yourself independently. So that definitely is true. And then also, Mark, I messed up. It is actually the person who has the question is not the upstate New York.
Oh.
But it's also, but they just, they didn't say their name, but this is, but we could call them YCBK fam because they said, I feel like I'm part of your family already.
We love that. We love that.
I got that wrong. So
we love that. That's okay.
Completely agree with you. I really like all of those points, and I've seen those work really well.
You know, there's one other thing I never shared. Let's talk about college list. So what I feel is that a parent should be involved initially in approving of a list. And then they need to vet those schools. right? So vet them for finances, go through the net price calculators, do all that, vet them for other things that might be of concern. You cannot expect a parent to pay for their child to go into an environment where they feel their kid is going over the cliff.
Right.
The parent has a right to speak up. But I believe once the parent approves the list, now let the student pick from the list.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what I think is a balance. So there is a role for a parent in the college list initially, especially like I do think parents should really try hard to resist making their kid their career do-over and trying to vicariously live through them to the extent where, like, if I had another shot, this is what I would do.
Right.
And own that and be honest about that, because there's a real pull in that direction to do that, and a lot of times it's subconscious, you don't even know you're doing it.
Right.
So I think that that's important that you do that, but at the same time, if there are things about a college that are just a non-starter, I think the parent has the right to speak up and say, that's just not going to work.
Right.
And it's actually better to be upfront with your kid early on about that than come in with a hammer later. So
Right.
there's also a place on the college list as well. I mean, sometimes one thing I don't like, I have to admit, sometimes I'll have a parent that will say, I don't want my kid going further than X amount, and it's really not that far away.
Mm.
And sometimes I think that parents do need to not have the rein so tight on that one.
Right.
Like, let the kid, I'm not saying they can go, another country 5,000 miles away, but I will push back if I hear like a parent say, well, I don't want them going more towards way because I'm going to miss them a lot. Like, I will push back a little bit on that if that's the motive.
Yes, me too.
Yeah. So hopefully this was helpful. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you. I had a great question.
Yeah, and for YCBK fan, you are definitely going to get a copy of Elliot Felix's book. And the name of Elliot Felix's book, How to Get the Most Out of College, the subtitle, 127 Ways to Make Connections, Make It Work for You, and Make a Difference. And read the reviews of this book on Amazon, because there are a ton of reviews on Amazon, and the reviews are really favorable. You can also go back and listen to Lisa's excellent interview with Elliot. But we all want to be successful in college, and this book gives 127 ways you can do that. So for sending in a SpeakPipe question, look for a book to come your way. Oh, let me say one last thing. If you could email your address, that would be helpful. Now, most of the time when people do a SpeakPipe question, their email is there. So I do have a way of reaching out if I don't hear from you, but I do appreciate the people that say, you answered my question. Here's my address. And he just saves us a step in the process. So if you could, just shoot that address over with your name. Now you're going to have to reveal your name. You don't have to do it on the air, but you're going to have to reveal it so we can send you your book, and just send that to questions@yourcloudsbrownkick.com. Thank you.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, I am exhilarated about this interview. One of my favorites that we've had. Of course, I have recency bias, so I think the one I'm always doing is my favorite, but I really like this interview. In some ways, if you heard my interview with Akil Bello, we called that Tough Questions About Test Scores. And we really could call this one Tough Questions About Admissions. So Julia joins me for this interview, and I do apologize. Julia had some tech issues, so you won't hear her a lot on the first part, but it's a 4-parter. And so she certainly makes her presence known in the rest of the interview. But one reason why I love podcasting is because we get to talk to the thought leaders. I remember looking at Charlie Rose. For those of you who know Charlie Rose, I used to think, he has a really good job. He gets to sit down, talk with movers and shakers internationally and nationally in all areas. And I feel blessed and privileged that that's what I get a chance to do. And Lee Coffin is one of the giants in the profession, the Vice Provost of enrollment at Dartmouth College, a veteran who's in his 5th decade in admissions. And I really want to thank Julia because she's the one who set this one up. But you're gonna be hearing from Lee for the next 7 weeks, and I would never do that to you if I didn't think he would deliver the kind of content and insight that would not only hold your attention, but I think it's why you listen to your college-bound kid, because you're gonna learn something, no matter if you've been doing this for 45 years or for 4 days. And this interview is definitely one that everybody's gonna learn something. So in part one, Lee tells us about his background, going all the way back to when he was in high school. Lee answers the question, how is being a dean in a boarding school different than being a dean in college? Because he's been a dean at both Milton Academy and at 3 different colleges. Lee answers the question, what were the differences being a dean at Connecticut College compared to Tufts and compared to Dartmouth? Lee is asked how he would explain the difference between their early decision admit rate, which is so much higher than their regular decision admit rate. Is there something going on there that those of you not on the inside may not see? And Lee talks about how athletic recruiting skews the early decision numbers. Listen and enjoy to one of my favorite interviews of the 154 that we've done so far on Your College Bound Kid. Friends, super excited today. I'm joined by both Lee Coffin, the Vice Provost and Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Dartmouth College, and Julia, one of our 7 co-hosts. Hi, Lee. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Julia.
Hi.
Hi, 6 missing co-hosts who.
Well, we're 2 of the 5.
Okay,
one of the other ones told me I better say hi to you, Susan Tree.
Oh, hi, Susan Tree from Westtown.
Yeah, we worked together for 9 years together there. So she said, you better say hi to Lee for me. So I got that off the plate there.
Hi back.
Julia, why don't you start by talking about how you know Lee?
I've kind of been following Lee for a little bit, I guess, by mistake. So Lee was the former director of admissions over at Milton Academy, where I work. And then Lee has come in clutch for my career multiple times in my 7 years at Milton. So most high schools will do sort of like a college kickoff night. And we had Lee come speak to our students pre-pandemic, but it's so helpful because they don't like to listen to me. But when I get to reference the VP or Dean of Admission, and suddenly people are listening really well. And then also I've been doing College Horizons since 2009, and Dartmouth has just shown up over and over again for so many College Horizons alumni. And I've been stuck with on multiple occasions one of my favorite people who works at Dartmouth, which is Stephen Abbott. And even for my program this summer for College Horizons at Emory, we have a intern in my group who is at Dartmouth. She just finished her first year. So there's, I guess the universe is telling us that, we just keep following each other or have these little points of intersection.
Julia, don't you think after a while we're all less than 1 degree apart anyway? Like as you start to scratch people's job history and where we might have gone to college, like there's a lot of cross-pollination that happens when you do this job for more than a few years.
I think so. Yeah. Especially in admissions, it's like a half degree of separation.
Yeah, a half degree. And I think that's surprising to like when I'm talking to families, if I reference another admission person and they say, oh, the dean at fill in the blank. I was like, yeah, she's my friend. And the idea that we are colleagues and friends feels mysterious and surprising to so many people that, there's a professional network. We're doing the same job. We're not rivals. We might be competitors in some context for co-admits, but we're all rowing in the same direction for the same purpose. And the longer you do it, the more people that kind of come into your orbit in some way.
Yeah.
Both in the college space, but also, people like you who have been admission officers and then change roles. And I hate the idea of the other side of the desk, but the other side of the desk
sounds creepy.
Because it's like, it feels more antagonistic than the idea that we're colleagues, one in a college and one in a school, and working with the same student.
So Lee, tell our listeners about your background, any places you've worked, or anything else you want to share that will just help them to understand the context from which you're going to speak today.
Sure. So I'm going to go a little farther back than where I worked. So I, once upon a time, was a first-gen college-bound student myself. And I often reflect on that identity and realize, like, I had an identity that wasn't an identity then. So, you know, in the early 80s, people weren't talking about first-gen college access. And so I popped out of a large suburban public high school in Connecticut that, like a lot of big schools, had a huge student to counselor ratio. I had very little interaction with the person in my school who was theoretically guiding me. And the line that I've often quoted that kind of motivated me to do this for a career was, when I went to see him in the fall of my senior year. I was in the top 10 in my class. I was like a very involved person. And he looked at my transcript and he said, "Ugh, I don't have time for the smart ones. Go back to class. You'll figure it out." And yeah. And at the time, I just remember being really stumped by that. I thought, I'm going to figure it out. And, you know, I'm telling this prehistoric story of a high school senior before the internet. So it wasn't like I can go online and figure it out as kids can today, but I did figure it out. But it was serendipity more than intentional how I got from where I was to Trinity College in my case. And for me, it was also a question of not only of getting in, but being able to afford it. And so financial aid was the lifeblood that made college possible for me. And so when I was graduating with a degree in history and thought, okay, now what? If I go to law school, like what career is knocking on my door? I applied for it and got my first job working in academia, and that turned into grad school, and then ultimately to my first admissions job in 1990 at Connecticut College. And I stayed there for 11 years, ultimately as dean of admissions for 6. And off I went. And so here I am at Dartmouth, finishing my 28th year as a dean of admissions. So 6 at Conn. I was dean of admission financial aid at Milton for 2 years, a slight detour into secondary schools, and then right back to Tufts, where I was the dean of undergraduate admissions for 13, and now starting my 8th year here at Dartmouth. So in some weird way, like I don't feel like an old timer, but you know, I've been a dean for almost 3 decades, and so when I think about my peer group around the country, I've been sobered by the idea that wow, I'm getting grayer than most. But I think as we have this conversation, it also informs the way I've been thinking about our current moment, because you know, I can go back to the 90s and think about what has shifted, what's still true. You know, the fundamentals over those years remain intact, but the strategies, certainly the volume, has moved in ways I don't think I ever could have imagined when I was a brand new dean. And so that's my story, and I am happy to have this conversation with you.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
So friends, I had a really interesting week this week. I had 2 different students that did essays, and it was very obvious to me that they'd used ChatGPT. I mean, one in particular, like the writing was so flowery and elegant. It's just not how students speak. And so I had to have a conversation with him. And of course, he admitted it. And then credit to him, he made significant changes to that essay. But then his mom got back to me and said, the essay is still showing that he's using AI. And our recommended resource this week is GPT0.me. So what is GPT0.me? Well, it's considered a leading AI detector. So the family was using GPT0.me to check whether or not AI was involved in the use of the essay. And after they improved it, it was just one little small part, I think, that triggered the GPT thing. But it's a tool that you can use yourself. So check out GPT0.me and AI content detector and writing CAPTCHA for ChatGPT. We'll now return to Julia and I in our interview with Lee Coffin, the VP of Enrollment at Dartmouth College. No, this is great. And we have a lot of questions for you. We have several that have been sent in from our listeners and several we have as well. And so we're going to kind of divide it up into kind of two halves, what I'm calling tough talk about college admissions or tough questions about college admissions. And then, of course, we do have to tap into those insights on Dartmouth College. And we have lots of listeners who have asked us to have you on to talk about that. So I actually want to start out with something, and I never shared this with you before as a question, but it popped in my mind. You were at Milton, and so you've seen particularly secondary school admissions, boarding, or of course Milton's boarding day versus college admissions. My background was mostly boarding school admissions at Westtown, small little stint in college. How do you see boarding school admissions and college admissions being similar and different?
Yeah. So it's an interesting question because I am a rare bird in that I've been a dean in both spaces. To me, what was surprising when I went from Connecticut College to Milton, and at Milton I was in charge of middle school admission as well as upper school day and boarding. So I had 3 distinct entry points, and they were so different from each other. I mean, the fundamentals are always based on academic achievement and potential and a student's ability to thrive in the academic space represented on that campus. And so that's been true whether I was meeting potential middle school kids coming out of 6th grade or high school seniors looking at college. I mean, the academic journey, the transcript as a document that both helps us map the future to the degree we can look at someone's recent history and say, this person has the ingredients to be successful in the curriculum the faculty where I work offers. That's been the same. I think the younger we were, say that again, the younger students obviously had different and emerging talents and skills and curricula than kids coming out of an advanced curriculum in their high school. But we talked about the same things. We talked about curiosity. We talked about tapping into that part of yourself that wanted to learn and ask questions and make connections and be part of a classroom experience that was dynamic. So that's a common denominator across both. I think the biggest thing I noticed was the role of a parent in middle or secondary school admission versus college. I mean, as we all know, and I think a lot of your listeners are parents. Parents are very front and center in a college admission process, but to a much larger degree, the conversation goes through the high school senior, with parents chiming in, listening, often maybe one step behind the student as we go through. But, when I was at Milton, I was struck by, I was having conversations with moms and dads about the right academic space for their child. And, some of the kids looking at the 11th grade entry point were a bit closer to my norm, but that was the biggest difference. And then the other thing I was struck by is how many people looking at a place like Milton were coming from communities where there was a really terrific public high school that could also be the default option, and a very excellent one that would not cost anything other than your taxes. So, making the case to families about what's the value proposition of an independent school. And if it's a boarding school, letting go, like allowing your child to live away from home, whether home was an hour away or a 10-hour flight away. That was a very different way of thinking about admissions and especially in April when people were making decisions, I mean, much more personal conversations than I think most of the people who apply to a place like Dartmouth or Tufts or Connecticut College. They've already answered the question, I am going to college. Where, open-ended, affordability, always part of it for most families, but going to college, not the question where I've worked.
And what about looking at Connecticut College, Tufts versus Dartmouth? I mean, there's some obvious ones. Dartmouth is the most well-resourced. And so, that comes into play in some ways. And the most selective, although Tufts is getting pretty selective these days,
Yeah.
But any other differences in terms of like how files were read or approaches to admission when you sort of compare those three institutions that you've looked at a lot?
So what's interesting is I've been the dean at all three. So the answer to your question is a little bit Lee-centric.
Sure.
Because as I've kind of left, what I learned how to do at Connecticut College, I brought with me to Milton and then Tufts and then Dartmouth. And it's iterative. I mean, it builds on itself, and each place has its own priorities and practices. But I have held to the same truth over these 28 years as a dean, which is I work really hard with my team to make it a narrative-based, student-centric process. And the three places, I'll set Milton aside for a sec, but the three colleges, they're all liberal arts in their curricular focus. They're all residential. They're all pulling students from around the world. I mean, more so today than in the 90s, but and we're building community. And so part of the work, whether the admit rate was 32% at Conn College, or when I left Tufts, it was at 14, and now I'm in a place hovering in the single digits for the last several years. And those numbers represent supply and demand. And not to make it too economics 101, but one of the things I say to parents a lot when I'm counseling them about navigating volume, navigating the odds of admission, I say, look, you see the acceptance rates, and fundamentally what it means is the institution you're considering has more qualified students than seats in the class. And that's the way selectivity is framed. And there's some fantastic places that don't have that conundrum. They're able to take most people who are qualified and off we go. And then as the admit rate gets smaller and smaller and tighter and more precise, it's a function of we have to shape as well as figure out who can do the work. And so to your question, Mark, the three places where I've been a dean of admissions in the college realm, I think have all shared the same fundamental purpose around holistic review, thinking about fit at the end of the process to say, I've been deliberate in where I've been dean. So, searches come and go. And when I've been intrigued or when I've said yes, all three of them have been places in a moment of transition. And I find my own professional itch is to help places creatively look forward. And that was true at Milton as well, where there was a boarding initiative that was taking hold when I was hired, and, helping Milton Academy think about itself in a more multidimensional way than just being a day school with boarders, but to really say, no, these are co-equal pieces of this institution. And I'm attracted to that moment of, I don't want to say redefinition, but reimagination of where we are. And when I was hired here at Dartmouth, there was a moment where, the provost who hired me said, we are almost 250 years old, but we're about to raise a lot of money for need-based financial aid. And we want to be thinking more creatively about how we might use it and where we might go to recruit. And I thought, that's exciting. Like, there's this moment of elasticity in a place that was one of the 10 original colleges in the United States before it was the United States. So, yeah.
Great. So, Lee, one thing I like to look at every year is the acceptance rate in ED versus regular.
Yep.
And this last year, at least according to all of the published ones, Dartmouth had the biggest difference. It was like almost 7-1. Like maybe you'd probably know the exact numbers, but what was the ED acceptance rate in the mid-20s and the RD closer to 4? This would have been 2022, not 2023. Data.
So it was about, we've been hovering around 20% early and 5-ish in regular.
Yeah, I know 2023 data, but I've heard you explain it as, I've liked the way you've explained it. Like in regular, in early, we need everybody, right? We need all types of kids. And so if we have someone who's perfectly qualified and they really want to come, we sort of ask ourselves, why not? When in later rounds where spots are tight, maybe it's a different question. But how would you explain the difference in admit rate between, the ED pool and the RD pool at Dartmouth?
Yeah. Well, I think data is also devilish. And this is a great example of the nuance gets erased by just looking at ED versus RD. So in our example,
too, right?
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to say. So at Dartmouth, Dartmouth is a member of the Ivy League, which some people are surprised when I say it is an athletic conference, and it's a Division I NCAA athletic conference. And most of our recruited athletes proceed into our admission process through the early round. And that's true at a lot of places. What makes it more notable at Dartmouth is we are the smallest member of the Ivy League by 24%. So we all have the same rough number of student athletes because the cohorts are set by the number of varsity teams, not the size of the entering class. So you add that cohort into my class and it pushes the admit rate up to 20-ish%, where versus a larger institution, it starts to drop. So that's really the fundamental, if I remove my athletic cohort from early decision, the admit rate is about 12 to 14% in early. And in that kind of non-athletic space, I think a bigger way of saying what you were imagining, Mark, is I read every file in December and I think this person has identified this place as a first choice, as the first choice. Is there a path to a yes to honor that student's affinity and declaration of love? And we don't have that same luxury in March. When students have applied to numerous places, we don't ask them where we sit on their priority list. But we know in December that every single person who has filed an application has made a conscious choice about this is where I see myself, and if admitted, I will enroll. So I think the trick is to not over-enroll early. I mean, we've with our peer group, we are on the lower end of the range in terms of percentage of the class that we take. But I think for some students, it's a really wise moment to apply once, to be intentional. And my cautionary tale is people look at admit rates and draw conclusions that, it's easier to get in. It's just a different round with different intentionality. It is not easier. If you were to look at the admitted student profile, there's no daylight between the early and the regular rounds in terms of who and what their academic records and what the rainbow of their identities represent. And I think people make a mistake when they see early as the aspirational round.
Friends, this concludes the first part of what'll be a 4-part interview with Lee that I'm calling Tough Talk About Admissions, or miscellaneous admissions topics that go back and forth on both titles. We hope you'll join us next week for part 2.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, hopefully you heard the first part of Lynda and Lisa. and their excellent conversation they had last week about the University of San Francisco and Lynda's recent visit there. It's now time for the final part. Listen and enjoy.
They do have a career office with great internships online. They really push their freshmen and sophomore to get in there and get their LinkedIn set up early. They have monthly workshops, resume writing, and that all lasts for a year after graduation, which I have to tell you, I was kind of surprised that it only lasts for a year after graduation.
Yeah, that is surprising. You're probably used to the University of Chicago where it lasts forever. Like I could go back there and have them help me at this point. So
Right? I was surprised. Now you can, I guess you can purchase additional services after that first year, for a fee, and it's a really pretty nominal fee. And it, it seemed odd to me that they just wouldn't say, come on back. But okay. They do offer career fairs. They have study abroad, as you would expect, partnerships in 45 countries. And they also have shorter service trips and field immersion programs, which last just 2 or 3 weeks during intersessions. So if you're feeling you really can't take time out from your academic plan to study abroad for a semester, they do have other opportunities. And I really like those kind of short-term options. I feel strongly if you can study abroad, even if it's just for a couple of weeks, you should definitely take advantage of it. Yes, absolutely. And for their study abroad, financial aid does carry over to those opportunities, with the exception of flight and eating all of that good food abroad. Because, that's what I do when I travel. Orientation, residence life, they have, well, I'll tell you, touring some of the dorms, and I was there during their spring break, so we could get into some of the dorms and see them. And there was a sign on one of the common rooms that was very disconcerting, and it was a coyote sighting on campus. Like, like Wile E. Coyote. Yes.
And, yeah. Well, we get coyotes all the time in Illinois and North Carolina, but I didn't think there'd be one in the Richmond neighborhood of San Francisco.
Me neither. And so I thought it was like a joke. But no, the joke was on me because I guess it was a real thing. And I was getting schooled on wildlife at USF. So yes, apparently that has happened on occasion, but of course they're more scared of you than, you are of them, or however that goes. But yeah, that was a little frightening. They have multiple different types of dorms. As you would expect, they have a new dorm that is suite style. Their older dorms don't have air conditioning. So, in San Francisco, you generally don't need it. And because they are fairly close to the water, they have these breezes. So you open the windows, but they do have in-room heaters. So you can control your own heat, but you're not going to have air conditioning in at least the older dorms. But the newer dorms do. They do have one all-female dorm. They have in the dorms that they're segregated by sex on floors. So you have a male floor and then a female floor. But they also have gender inclusive housing, single sex by floor. That's the phrase I was looking for. Again, guaranteed for 2 years, off-campus housing. Now, for the off-campus housing, they have that department that is going to work with you. It's the off-campus housing department, and they will also review like your rental agreements and work with you to make sure that you're not being taken advantage of by unscrupulous landlords, which I thought was, I
guess there probably were some reasons, where they had to develop that service. I can only imagine.
Oh, I would love to live in San Francisco, but holy moly, the rents are crazy, but not for students. They assure me it is very doable. Another thing, they do have learning living communities. They've got about 5 choices. And unusually, they've got a couple are for first years, some are for second or third years, and then some are for all 4 years. So they do have a mix. Some of those were in flux when I was there. They were looking at changing some of the themes of those. They also have student disability services, as you would expect. They have computer labs with adaptive tech. They loan assistive technology. Emotional support animals are allowed on campus, but in dorm rooms only.
Wait, you can't bring your cat to class? What?
I know, right?
What if little
No.
Fluffy wants to learn about, I don't know, environmental sciences? So,
Well, you have a way smarter cat than I do.
well, I have so many. One of them's got to be a genius, I feel like, just statistically. So,
well, mine would be much happier back at the dorm in the sunbeam, you know, taking in the view of the Golden Gate Bridge. I mean, honestly, the views from the dorm rooms were amazing. I'm just going to
yeah.
keep saying that.
Well, that's not something you can get every day, right? So,
No. And it was really nice because I could actually see it that day, which of course is not always the case in San Francisco weather. Sports and activities, they have them.
Yes, check.
They have them.
See, now this would be where Mark would ask you about what the strongest team was and maybe mention an athlete. And I'm just going to say, that's great. They play sports ball there. Fantastic.
They do. And the mascot is the Dons. So D1 athletics, basketball, I think is probably the most popular. But yes, they have them. They do have great workout facilities. They have the Cora Health and Recreation Center with an indoor pool, all kinds of student clubs. The ethnic clubs are really popular, and of course, they put on all kinds of activities throughout the school year. So I think there's a very strong student life there. Including student athletics. Anyway, financial aid and cost of attendance. Cost of attendance for the school right now is $83,662, which is kind of a high sticker price. But 91% of students received aid, and that average aid package is almost $36,000. They do offer merit, and their merit aid looks at grades only. So they're not looking for essays or additional activities or anything like that. They do have a chart on their website, and their merit packages go from $21,000 all the way up to $29,000 a year. And the GPA required to maintain those merit awards is 2.5, which I think is really generous. So it's not one of those crazy requirements, of a 3.5 or even higher.
Yeah.
So generous merit aid. And then they do have some need-based aid as well. They have jobs on campus. So they have work study jobs, that you would qualify for through the FAFSA, but you don't have to be work study qualified to work on campus. To apply, they are on the Common App. Things that they're looking for, they're primarily going to look at your grades, your GPA, and the rigor of your classes. They will also look strongly at your essay, your personal qualities, and it's your volunteer work. So it's a Jesuit school and they believe in service. And so they're going to look to make sure that your priorities align with theirs. They do look at demonstrated interest, but that's not one of the top things that they look at.
Yeah, they have a supplemental essay. I haven't checked for this year yet, but in years past, it's been on service. And, I think, how that's either played a role in your life or what your thoughts are about that. So, it's definitely important to complete that. They do look at that.
Yeah. And because we're recording this on Common App Day,
Yeah, I know.
I did look. Of
course you did. Of course you
and
did.
and
I had
it
my cat look for me,
seemed
but he hasn't written up his report yet.
well, I'm glad to hear your cat's awake. Mine is still sleeping somewhere. Well, and of course, one is still living under the sofa. The essay question is, I'm just going to read it quick. The University of San Francisco's Jesuit tradition emphasizes community engagement and education for social justice, inspiring our students to become passionate agents for others. How do you see yourself becoming a part of this mission? So that just kind of says it all. That really sums up what the school is about and what they are looking for. They are a test optional school, and they were test optional before the pandemic.
Right.
They made that change in 2019, and about 84% of their students apply test optional, and 70% of students who apply test optional are admitted. So it's definitely not required that you have testing. Recommendations are optional, but very helpful, and most students do submit them. They have ED. Uh, and one of the things with their early decision program is students get priority registration and housing assignments.
Yeah, because like now that they can give out special favors to the kids who ED. So I'm really
Yeah.
seeing that more this year.
Yeah. I would not, that would not be the reason to apply early decision, but it is a nice benefit, particularly probably for housing. But they also offer early action. And what they said in the information center, it really, they take about a third of the class in each of those um, application programs. So, if you do end up applying regular decision, when their deadline is January 15th, it's not like, you're going to have only a 2% chance of getting into the school.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things they do is they do take transfer students. So if you are looking to transfer into a school, definitely take a look at University of San Francisco. So who do I think it would be good for? Just like we said earlier, Lisa, it's a great school for students who are looking for a city experience, because you get, I still think, one of the best cities in the world in San Francisco. There's just a lot there to offer. I love that you can cross the bridge and you're really kind of in nature. So there's a lot to offer there. But again, having that compact enclosed campus feel. It's a Jesuit school, so if you are a student who is interested in serving others, learning about yourself, likes a core curriculum, this would be a good one. If you want to meet students from all over the world, if you're looking to kind of break out of, maybe you've been in a bubble, this would be a great school for that. I can't emphasize enough, if you're looking for a nursing program, it's
top notch.
Terrific. It really is. But they have some really interesting programs as well. I love that art history and museum studies program. Their business majors are really interesting, and they do have some STEM classes as well. But that's University of San Francisco.
Well, yeah, I think it's a really interesting school. And I think it's one of those schools that has a lot to offer a lot of students. Some schools you'd be like, okay, well, this would be good for a certain type of student. I'm having a hard time trying to think of a student it wouldn't be good for, in a way. I guess it's just someone who really hates cities and thinks the Golden Gate Bridge is unattractive and does not want to look at it out of their window. Things like that, because it's just it has a lot of things going for it. Do you know anything about their financial health at all? Like how the school is doing in terms of endowment or things like that?
Lisa, I don't, but I can report back on that.
Sure. Yeah. That would be like my only concern. And I don't have any actual data on that. It's just sort of, sometimes with some of these liberal arts schools or their smaller universities, sometimes things have been harder for them. But other than that, I mean, it's a great school. My daughter ended up not wanting to apply because, frankly, I don't think she wanted to walk up that hill all the time. I mean, Elon's pretty flat. So,
I don't blame her with that. And, I would say that there was a lot of building going on the campus. So I'm hopeful that their financial health is good, because they definitely had some cranes and building the
yeah, well,
new
that's always a
dorm
good
and thing like that.
sign, when you see all the buildings going up.
Well, and
So,
another thing that really struck me, and was there with my husband, went with me, because we were going right from there somewhere else. He spent his time in the library working, God bless him. But having just come from Berkeley the day before and coming to USF, the grounds are beautiful. I did not see a lot of deferred maintenance.
yeah,
And
so
I'm
that's
not sure
another
that's
great sign.
necessarily the case at Berkeley. It was kind of a stark difference.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that it's interesting that Berkeley did not have that. So yeah, I guess that I'm looking here, and Dr. Google is telling me that their endowment has grown 60% over the past 10 years, and it's now 345 million. So, I guess they're having some growth, and that's good.
Yeah, the impression I got was they are really looking at growing programs, and they would love to be able to grow their health sciences programs, I think, but there are some constraints around that.
Hmm.
But having such good relationships with hospitals in the Bay Area, it's just a premier program.
Yeah. No, when Lily and I visited, we took an Uber there, and our Uber driver, his son was a freshman at the University of San Francisco in the nursing program, and he could not say enough phenomenal things about the school.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it's just got a great reputation for that.
Truly, truly, with some great programs, and I'm with you. I'm not sure. Um, it's such a welcoming place, unless you were looking for a really specific STEM major. Um, Otherwise, it's a great liberal arts school.
Hmm. Yeah, fantastic. Well, it's another one of those gems to investigate in your college search.
Yeah, it shows up on a lot of our students' college
Hmm.
lists
Hmm.
for that
Sure
reason.
does. All right.
All right, Lisa, thank you.
Thank you.
Next episode, Mark will share some thoughts on a topic that is on his heart, and then we'll have part one of Lynda's interview with Ben Neely of Revolution Prep. The topic is helping us to understand the new digital SAT, which goes live in March.
And Dave, I wasn't sure when I gave you that outline what I wanted to talk about, but I want to talk about something along this line. I want to talk about something really creative that Wake Forest is doing on Monday to recruit that I think is ingenious. And so I'll be talking about that on Monday's episode. But friends, remember, it's not where you go, but it's what you do when you get there, and it's what you do when you get out of there. See you on Monday, friends. See you next month, Dave.
See you next month, my friend.
And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Lynda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou.
And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Lynda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.